You know, when you picture the ultimate showdown, like a classic heavyweight boxing match, you have certain expectations, right?
Oh, absolutely.
You expect to see two massive, incredibly trained fighters stepping into the ring under the bright lights.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a test of strength, of strategy, of power.
Right, because there are boundaries. There's an agreed upon arena.
Exactly. And you're expecting the rules of physics and the sport to just govern the outcome. It's a structured kind of violence, right?
Yeah, it's highly structured. And there's this fundamental assumption that the better, stronger, more heavily resourced fighter will inevitably win. Because, in a traditional match, power scales linearly. The harder you hit, the more likely you are to achieve victory.
Right, right. So imagine you're watching this fight alongside us today. The reigning champion, the absolute heavyweight king of the world, a fighter who has never been defeated in a straight match, comes out and just completely flattens the challenger in the first round.
Just a total knockout.
I mean, an absolute devastating textbook knockout. The crowd is going wild. The referee is stepping in. It looks like the most decisive victory you've ever seen. But then, as the champion is walking back to his corner to celebrate, the challenger, who is lying flat on the mat, suddenly opens a jar he had hidden in his glove.
And out of that jar swarms a million angry hornets.
Yes, a million hornets. And suddenly, they just change everything.
It's a very vivid and honestly structurally perfect image for the geopolitical reality we're dissecting today. Because hornets don't care about a heavyweight's right hook.
They really don't. The heavyweight champion's muscles, his decades of training, his perfect footwork, none of it matters. You can't punch a hornet. You definitely can't punch a million of them.
No, you can't.
And suddenly, the guy who just supposedly won the physical fight is the one running for his life, while the guy on the mat is somehow controlling the entire arena. So welcome to the Deep Dive, everyone. I am so glad you're here with us today because we have a truly mind-bending paradigm shift to explore.
We really do. We're looking at a fundamental collapse in how we understand power, conflict, and vulnerability. I mean, it is essentially the death of linear military logic.
Exactly. So for this deep dive, our objective, the reason you and I are sitting down to really chew on this stack of military analyses and intelligence reports, is to understand a startling, unprecedented mutation in modern warfare.
It's a complete mutation.
Specifically, how the current U.S. conflict with Iran has unexpectedly devolved. I mean, it started as a rapid, high-tech, seemingly absolute victory, and it has mutated into this grueling, unpredictable, and incredibly dangerous global slog.
And it's a mutation that challenges the very foundation of how global superpowers have operated since the end of the Second World War. The basic premise of deterrence is just completely unraveling.
Okay, let's unpack this. Could you give us the 30,000-foot view? What exactly is the core premise of this conflict's evolution?
Yeah, the 30,000-foot view is actually the perfect place to start because historically, whoever controls that 30,000-foot airspace dictates the terms of the war.
Right, air superiority.
Yeah, exactly. But what we're witnessing right now is the real-time collision of traditional multi-billion-dollar military supremacy with the raw, chaotic, and highly asymmetric power of mass-produced, cheap drone warfare.
It's wild to think about.
It is. It's, at its core, a story of how the underdog, the player, who is hopelessly outmatched in traditional metrics of military strength, finds a way to completely tip the playing field. They aren't trying to match the superpower's strength. They're just rendering that strength fundamentally irrelevant.
Rendering it irrelevant, I mean, that is an incredibly heavy concept for anyone listening to wrap their head around. Because when we talk about the U.S. military, we're talking about an entity that has defined global supremacy for generations.
Undisputed supremacy, yeah.
Right. The U.S. doesn't just fight wars. It engineers environments where losing is theoretically, mathematically impossible. So let's start at the beginning of this specific conflict, which really brings us to the illusion of traditional success.
The initial strike.
Yeah. If you were just following the initial sequence of events, you would think this was over before it even began.
From a traditional military standpoint, it essentially was. The opening of the air war against Iran was, by all conventional metrics, a complete masterclass in modern aerial supremacy.
The U.S. and Israel launched this initial strike, and it was a massively one-sided victory. We're talking about the kind of operation military academies will theoretically study for decades.
Oh, without a doubt.
They went in and they systematically dismantled the opponent's entire grid. Mark Gunzinger, who is an analyst at the Mitchell Institute for Aerospace Studies, laid out an assessment that is just staggering.
What did he say?
He noted that the U.S. and Israel achieved complete air superiority in under 2 days.
Wow, under 2 days.
Yeah. Iran's defenses were left in absolute tatters, erased from the board entirely. And on top of that, much of its military leadership, the command and control structure, was dead in those opening hours.
Right, and we need to pause and establish the mechanical reality of what air superiority actually means in a modern battle space.
Please do.
It doesn't just mean you have more fighter jets in the sky than the other guy. It means you own the electromagnetic spectrum.
You own the radar, the communications.
Exactly. It means the enemy cannot launch an aircraft to contest you. Their runways are cratered, and their ground-based anti-aircraft systems, like their radar dishes, their surface-to-air missile batteries, are completely blind, deaf, and functionally destroyed.
You can basically fly wherever you want, whenever you want.
Without fear of interception. It is the textbook definition of a decisive victory. But as we know, textbooks are written about the wars of the past, not the wars of the present.
Which brings us to a crucial twist in the story.
Right. There is a deeply pragmatic military axiom from former Defense Secretary James Mattis that is absolutely essential to understanding what happens next. He famously said, "The enemy gets a vote."
The enemy gets a vote. It sounds almost democratic, but the implications are incredibly dark. Break down the mechanics of that vote for us. What does that actually mean when you've supposedly just wiped out an opponent's military infrastructure?
It means that warfare is an interactive system. No matter how brilliant your plan is, no matter how flawlessly you execute your opening moves, you cannot control how your opponent is going to react when they are backed into a corner.
Especially when their survival is on the line.
Precisely. You might think you've taken away all their traditional options. You blew up their fighter jets, you disabled their radar arrays, but you haven't taken away their will to fight. You've simply forced them to fight differently.
They get a vote on the nature of the ensuing conflict.
Exactly.
And Iran's vote came in very quickly, and it looked absolutely nothing like the fight the U.S. and its allies were prepared for. I mean, within hours of those opening salvos, literally while the U.S. and Israel are presumably still slapping each other on the back for their massive kinetic success, Iran pivoted.
They had to pivot. Their traditional air force was totally neutralized. If they tried to send up their remaining legacy fighter jets, they would have been swatted out of the sky instantly.
So they abandoned that traditional domain entirely. They turned to a completely different nature of warfare. They unleashed waves of ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, and cheap lo-fi drones.
Right.
And I want to be very clear for you listening. We are not talking about the sleek, hyper-advanced stealth drones the U.S. uses, not Reapers or Global Hawks. We are talking about cheap, plastic, lo-fi drones.
This is the challenger on the mat opening that jar of hornets.
It's an incredibly apt analogy. It's like a heavyweight boxer knocking down a flyweight, only for the flyweight to unleash a swarm of hornets. And the unprecedented toll it took immediately is just staggering. A single drone, one of these cheap lo-fi hornets, managed to slip through and killed 6 American soldiers at a base in Kuwait.
Which completely shatters the illusion of invulnerability.
But wait, I have to push back on this. I have to express disbelief here, because how is this mechanically possible? We are talking about the most technologically advanced military in human history.
Yes, we are.
We have radar systems that can track an artillery shell moving at Mach 3 and shoot it down midair. How does a slow, low-tech fiberglass drone cause this much devastating confusion and just slip through? Why doesn't the system just swat it away?
What's fascinating here is that the confusion and the failure are actually byproducts of that very sophistication. Let me explain the underlying mechanics.
Okay, lay it out.
Multi-million-dollar defense systems are designed, calibrated, and tuned to fight other multi-million-dollar defense systems. A Patriot missile battery's radar is looking for a supersonic fighter jet or a high-altitude ballistic missile.
It's looking for a threat that behaves like an advanced weapon. It's looking for an equal.
Precisely. Radars use something called the Doppler effect to filter out background noise. They are programmed to ignore things moving under a certain speed, like birds or clouds.
Because otherwise the screen would just be static.
Exactly. It would just be a solid block of noise. Now, a cheap drone flies low, often hudging the terrain, and it flies very slowly. Plus, it's made of composite materials that don't bounce radar waves back very well.
So the multi-billion-dollar radar system literally filters it out. It assumes it's a flock of geese.
Yes. So to see the drones, the human operators have to actively lower the threshold of the radar. They have to tell the computer, show me the slow things too.
But when you open that gate, the screen must just light up with thousands of anomalies.
It does. Suddenly you're seeing every weather anomaly, every flock of birds, and hidden among them, dozens of lethal drones. The system gets overwhelmed, not just physically, but cognitively.
And the human operators have to make life or death decisions in seconds. Is that a flock of birds migrating, or is that a swarm of explosives heading for our barracks?
Right, and that immense cognitive overload, the sheer fog of war generated by these cheap swarms saturating the airspace, leads to absolute disaster.
Which explains the mechanics behind the friendly fire disaster. Amid the absolute chaos of trying to track all these unconventional threats buzzing through the airspace, a Kuwaiti F-18 fighter jet shot down 3 U.S. F-15 fighters.
The most ever lost in combat in a single incident like this. It is an event that rewrites the understanding of modern air combat.
3 highly advanced U.S. F-15s destroyed by an ally because the pilot was just so disoriented by the chaotic, saturated battle space created by these drones.
The fear and saturation peak and the traditional safety protocols just break down entirely. The drones didn't even have to shoot down the F-15s themselves. They simply had to create an environment so unpredictable that the advanced military structure began to consume itself.
It's terrifying, and the financial bleeding didn't stop there. By the second week of this conflict, Iran, this country whose defenses were supposedly in tatters, had destroyed sophisticated $500 million radar systems.
$500 million for a single array, blinded and destroyed by cheap fiberglass.
And they also took down 11 high-tech Reaper drones. The total cost for those 11 Reapers, $330 million.
Which is exactly why that initial assessment of victory was fundamentally flawed.
Right. So transitioning from that, we have to look at how Iran didn't just target military bases. They realized their disadvantage and changed the map entirely. They moved this from a military conflict to an economic one. Total war on the civilian front.
They initiated a total war scenario, but executed with precision disruption.
Let's talk about this expanding target list because it is vital for you listening to understand how this scales globally. Day after day, Iran starts raining down drones and missiles on regional civilian targets. The list expanded to include Israel, Bahrain, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the UAE.
They essentially turned the entire Middle East into a target-rich environment.
And look at the specific infrastructure they are hitting. Oil production facilities, desalination plants, data centers, airports. For instance, Tuesday's strike forced the UAE to shut down the Ruwais oil refinery.
And Ruwais is one of the world's largest oil refineries. Shutting it down sends immediate shockwaves through the global energy market.
But then there's the Strait of Hormuz.
Ah, yes. Iran's most impactful measure by far. The Strait of Hormuz is the quintessential geopolitical bottleneck.
It carries 20% of the world oil. 1/5 of the entire planet's oil supply has to pass through this narrow strip of water, and Iran shut it down.
By heavily mining the waters and deploying those same swarms of cheap drones over the water to harass any commercial vessel that attempts the passage.
And let's bring this directly to the listener, because geopolitics can feel very abstract. What is the direct impact on you when the Strait of Hormuz closes? Global oil prices go soaring. We are talking about projections where the price of oil could climb above $200 a barrel.
Which breaks the underlying math of global trade.
Right. $200 a barrel translates to roughly $6 or $7 for a gallon of gas in the U.S.
It triggers immediate, severe inflation across the entire global economy.
But wait, I have to ask. Why risk angering the entire surrounding region? What is the strategic value of hitting a desalination plant or a data center? I mean, a desalination plant just makes drinking water. So what does this all mean? Why shift the burden to the average civilian globally?
There's an analysis from Seth Jones at the Center for Strategic and International Studies that cuts right to the bone on this. He notes that when a regime's survival is at stake, almost anything is possible.
Survival, when the chips are down, the rules go out the window.
Exactly. If we connect this to the bigger picture, Iran knows it cannot defeat the U.S. military in a head-to-head kinetic fight, so they intentionally drag the U.S. into a different type of warfare.
To make the cost of continuing unbearable.
Unbearable for the global economy.
Yeah.
You hold 20% of the world's oil hostage, you hit their drinking water, and you say, if we go down, the global economy goes down with us.
Wow. It is extortion on a planetary scale. But to pull off this massive regional disruption without a functional air force, they relied on a playbook that has been evolving at hyperspeed for 4 years in Europe.
Yes. The Ukraine blueprint.
Right, the age of swarm warfare. Let's talk about the drone revolution in Ukraine. Because the core technology here is the drone, the UAV. And back in the desperate days of February 2022, Ukraine didn't start with sleek military hardware.
No, they started with off-the-shelf recreational models.
The exact kind you'd buy at a consumer electronics store. And they were literally duct-taped with small explosives.
MacGyver warfare.
Oh!
Utterly improvised, out of sheer necessity.
But the evolution is insane. It spawned a vast industry. Ukraine is now producing a massive amount of these drones, 1,500 drones a day.
A day. That is an astonishing manufacturing feat.
Here's where it gets really interesting. The goal is no longer high performance. Nobody is trying to build the perfect indestructible drone. The goal is sheer, overwhelming quantity.
Exactly. The paradigm shifted completely from quality to mass.
The strategy is to exhaust the enemy's resources to stop them. It's not about the drones surviving, it's about making the enemy run out of missiles or money. It is the definition of a poor man's Air Force.
And it fundamentally broke traditional warfare. A Mach 2 capable Russian fighter jet, a marvel of aeronautical engineering, is totally useless against a whirring 1-foot across quadcopter.
Because it's moving too fast to shoot something that small?
Right. The closing speed is immense. By the time the pilot sees the drone, they've already flown past it.
And the staggering success on the ground, 2,700 Russian tanks proved vulnerable to these drone swarms. Over the winter, this drone-centric military halted Russia's slow offensive. It allowed Ukraine to regain more territory last month than it had lost since 2023.
Which brings a very chilling realization to Western military planners.
The NATO wake-up call. There is this striking anecdote from a recent wargame exercise. A NATO commander was facing the incredibly tight decision loop of Ukrainian drone tactics in a simulation. He had to observe, orient, decide, and act against dozens of drones at once.
The cognitive cycle of combat.
Yeah, and human neurobiology just isn't built to process that much lethal information that fast. The NATO commander simply quipped to the room, "We're fed."
It's the terrifying realization that all the established doctrine might simply be overwhelmed by cheap electronics.
And we have to connect this back to Iran, because Iran isn't new to this. As a major supplier of the Shahed drones to Russia, Iran has been watching, learning, and gaining immense operational experience in this exact type of warfare.
They've been using Ukraine as a proxy testing ground. They saw what broke the Russian armored momentum, they saw what terrified that NATO commander, and they applied those lessons perfectly to the Gulf.
Which brings us to the core economic reality of this new warfare, the economics of attrition. This realization that quantity beats quality completely braced the U.S. military's traditional business model. We're talking about a manufacturing contest now.
It shifts from a contest of tactics to a contest of spreadsheets.
Right. Let's look at the flaw of exquisite weaponry. The U.S. spent a decade and $44 billion building just 21 B-2 bombers.
$44 billion for 21 aircraft.
Because the philosophy was to hit anyone, anywhere, with zero risk of human life using a small number of incredibly advanced tools. But in this new order of battle, there is no single place to drop the mother of all bombs to end a swarm of cheap, just good enough drones.
Exactly. You can't use a multi-billion-dollar bomber to hunt individual pickup trucks launching drones from under highway overpasses.
So you have to play defense. And this brings us to the brutal math of interception. The cost-exchange ratio is just wince-inducing. Each Iranian Shahed drone costs $20,000 to $50,000.
Basically pocket change in military terms.
Meanwhile, one American Raytheon Coyote interceptor used to shoot it down costs $126,500.
Right.
So you're spending roughly $126,000 to swat down $20,000 worth of fiberglass, and they are sending waves of 100 at a time.
Which is why it is strategically cheaper and easier to play offense than defense in drone warfare. Thomas Withington from the Royal United Services Institute really boils it down. He says it's an industrial battle.
It's about whose factories can pump out the most fastest, which leads to the proliferation problem. Because this warfare is so accessible now, even stateless Houthi rebels and narco-cartels use it. And despite total economic and diplomatic isolation, Iran pumps out an estimated 10,000 drones per month.
10,000 a month, while operating under a global embargo.
It's insane. So the U.S. pivot. The U.S. military recently launched a response called the LUCS, the Low-Cost Unmanned Combat Attack System. It's based on the Shahed design. It costs $35,000 each, and it was just used for the first time.
At a remarkable admission by the U.S. military.
But wait, I have to push back here. Are we basically just copying their homework? How does a superpower get out-manufactured by an isolated regime? And more importantly, does mass-producing our own cheap drones actually solve the problem of defending our bases and global oil supplies?
It's a classic innovator's dilemma. The U.S. optimized for exquisite, complex machines. You can't just flip a switch and start stamping out cheap plastic drones.
Yeah.
Iran had no choice but to optimize for cheap mass production.
But does building the LUCS solve the defensive nightmare?
Largely, no. Having your own offensive drones allows you to strike back cheaply. But it doesn't solve the defense. Your cheap drone cannot effectively intercept their cheap drone midair. You are still left with the fundamental vulnerability of your critical civilian infrastructure.
Right. Which leads perfectly into the geographic reality of why this conflict is an unwinnable whack-a-mole. Even if the U.S. can build cheaper interceptors, the physical reality of stopping a highly dispersed arsenal presents an almost impossible geographic challenge.
The tyranny of geography.
Let's talk about the mouse infestation analogy. It's used by military planners to describe the limitation of U.S. airstrikes trying to take out Iranian drone stores and missile launchers.
Yeah, they say it is like trying to take on a mouse infestation with a hammer.
Because they will always be hiding out of sight. A traditional airstrike is a powerful hammer, but the mice, the drone launchers, are bolted to the beds of commercial pickup trucks. They scatter, they hide in civilian garages or deep mountain tunnels.
This raises an important question. How do you permanently disarm an enemy that doesn't need air bases to launch attacks?
Because they don't need massive runways. They can launch from a shipping container driving down a public highway. To really drive home the scale of this, we need to compare it to Israel and Hamas in Gaza.
It's the most pertinent comparison.
After October 7, Israel tried to wipe out Hamas's rocket arsenal, but Hamas kept shooting for months, and that was in a tiny area directly adjacent to Israel, a confined urban space.
Now contrast that with Iran.
The scale comparison is terrifying. Iran is 4,000 times larger than Gaza. 4,000 times. And it's located 1,000 miles away from the primary Allied bases.
You're trading a confined environment for a massive mountainous country 1,000 miles away.
And they have a massive stockpile, much larger than Hamas ever did. Sources say they may still have more than half of their starting drones and missiles, despite all the airstrikes.
They've absorbed the absolute best kinetic punch the U.S. could throw, and they still have more than 50% capacity remaining.
Which leads to the quagmire. Retired F-16 pilot John Waters summarized it bluntly. He said, "This is a quagmire.
A war of attrition."
It leads to endless bleeding without either side landing a knockout punch, just as seen in Ukraine. The U.S. is staring down a conflict with no clear, centralized target to destroy.
It is the definitive death of the decisive victory.
So, as we wrap up this deep dive, the picture we've painted of the modern battle space is, well, it's bleak. A brilliant initial military victory derailed by cheap technology, shifting into an economic war of attrition. We went from $500 million radars being blinded by cheap swarms, to the Strait of Hormuz being held hostage, to an unwinnable game of whack-a-mole across a country 4,000 times the size of Gaza.
And this brings us to the ultimate chilling conclusion derived from the text.
Let's hear it.
Fred Weary, from the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, points out the most dangerous long-term consequence here. He says that leaving a regime in power under these circumstances convinces them more than ever that they need a nuclear weapon as a deterrent. Quote, "That's the great tragedy of this."
Because from their perspective, this entire sequence proved that asymmetric warfare works. It kept them alive. So if we build on this for a final thought for the listener, if swarms of $20,000 drones can completely stall the world's greatest superpower, crater the global economy, and render traditional air superiority obsolete, what happens when those same uninterceptable swarm tactics are paired with the nuclear capability Iran is now so desperate to acquire?
It's a scenario doctrine just has no answer for.
How does traditional nuclear deterrence even work when the delivery system isn't a massive ICBM, but a cheap plastic drone flying quietly under the radar? It's the champion boxer lying on the mat, not just releasing a jar of hornets to sting you, but releasing a jar of hornets carrying a lethal venom we have absolutely no antidote for.
It really makes you question everything we assume about global security.
It absolutely does. Well, thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive, everyone. And Expert, thank you as always.
Thanks for having me.
We'll leave you to ponder that final unsettling question. Until next time, take care.